Okay, so I'm not actually quite sure to what extent the people who are here now are the same who were in the previous session. So I thought I'd maybe also start off with basically just saying a bit more about myself, seeing as a workshop is a sort of more of an interactive format. And I'd also like you to participate as well. There's several possibilities. You can either put on your microphones when you've got something to say, or we can also use the chat as well, although I'm not quite sure whether I can actually see the chat because I've got two screens and I get very confused about. Yes, I can see the chat theoretically.
I'll take care of that.
Yeah, okay, it's all right. I've got it on the other screen at the moment, so I can see both. Right, okay. So yes, as I said in the previous talk, I was a what's it called, a native teacher for 12 years. I worked at a CLIL in a CLIL project in Klagenfurt. So that's my sort of like background from the practical perspective, but I've also done quite a lot of seminars or workshops with teachers in Austria, from Salzburg to Burgenland. And so I've also sort of like had a lot of experience more recently as well in seeing how it works, particularly in vocational schools and colleges. Right, okay, so because I'm a sort of creature of habit, the first slide again is I'd like to find out where people are. And I've got a different Padlet set up now. But what I'd also like to find out is what your subjects are. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to click, or rather to send the link into the chat for Padlet so that you don't have to type it in. But of course, if you've got a QR reader on your phone, you can do that. Right, okay, so here's the new Padlet code to tell us where you are. And I've also got two Mentimeter things where I'd like you to tell us what subjects you teach. Now, I asked originally for you to put it in German, but it doesn't matter if you put it in German or English. We'll just see what range of subjects that we've got here. And also what school type you teach at. So if you teach at an Austrian school, can you use the sort of standard abbreviation like HTL or HAC so that we can see when people type in the same answers? And if you teach at another school type, then type it in. So I'll give you a bit of time to answer those questions first. And I'll have some, well, water. Right, so in connection with the school type, we've just got two people who filled that in. We've got one teaching at a HTL and one at a HLV. In connection with subjects, English is the biggest, the one which most people have replied to. But we've also got some other subjects as well, like religion, Elektrotechnik, Automatisierungstechnik, Kommunikation, so communication and things like that. Right, okay, we've now got 11 people in Padlet. Yeah, there's some more from Italy, then Spain again, and then it's a bit difficult because I don't know what the rivers are. Yay, somebody's just arrived at the other end of Austria, I guess. Right, okay, what I'll probably do is include these in my presentation afterwards. You can't see who's from where, just to sort of like give us an idea of who's taking part from all of the different countries and things like that. Great, okay. So where's the thing gone? Right, okay. So as I said earlier on, what I want to look at in the workshop has to do with using authentic materials, and by authentic materials I mean either written materials but also audio and visual materials, so videos that you can find online, for example, podcasts or what have you, so where you've just got audio, and in connection with all sorts of different materials which are actually produced for a different audience. So for example, instruction manuals are produced by companies for the users of equipment, for example, or for devices or what have you. Company websites, depending on the company, this can be business to business or business to client, for example. Promotional materials can also sort of like fit into both categories as well. And the other category which you might sort of like come across is educational materials which were developed for English speakers. So materials which are very specific for your particular subject area, but which of course have been developed for people who've got a different level of English. So a similar cognitive level, a similar extent of knowledge, for example, but a different challenge in terms of the linguistic input. And of course, depending on how common your subjects are, you might be able to work together with other colleagues at your school, or there might be other colleagues in nearby schools or other colleagues in Austria where you can actually share materials with each other, because you all know that some of the challenges are then actually sort of like trying to find materials, and if you have other people who find them. Okay, right, so people have already added stuff. The Padlet should have worked, but Mentimeter was something else anyway, but thanks for adding the information in the chat, which is now open. Yeah, so depending on what school type you teach at, depending on how special your subject is, it can be easier or more difficult for you to work together with other subject areas to find suitable materials. And the question which is always really interesting to ask is, are you working hard or are you working smart? Because working hard is not always enough. You also have to work smart. And this is something which applies to teachers and to pupils alike as well. Now, I've got some sort of like general information to start off with in connection with sort of like learning, and a couple of these keywords also came up in the previous talk as well. Because one thing that I think is really important, and also in connection with teaching subjects in German as well, for example, where you've got students who do not speak German so well, for example, because they've only moved to Austria recently, or because they tend to speak dialect at home, for example, that in order to learn, you need to use language, and then you use the language to learn, with the exception of practical subjects some of the time, as I already said. And I think what is also really important in a CLIL situation is that you can't do the work for your students in class. In other words, you've got to be smart outside of class, and then your students have to be smart in class once you've sort of like set up the work for them. And the reason for this is this diagram here, which is meant to illustrate the relationship between input, intake, and output. So for example, if all you do in a class is provide input, which is what I'm doing at the moment, I admit, then I can provide a lot of input, but out of that input, only a smaller amount actually ends up being taken in by the students in the class or by the people who are listening to this part of the workshop right now. And that intake only turns into a smaller amount of output, but again, you need to give students the opportunity to actually make use of what you gave them, so that it turns into knowledge for themselves, that they've actually learned something using language to learn. And then the third statement I like quite a lot as well is that the more you think, the more you can learn. So again, this is another reason in your CLIL classes for making sure that during the lesson, it's your students who are doing the work, that they're working smart, so that they can think about what the contents are and can also learn about what the contents are as well. So they need to be engaged, particularly in CLIL, but actually I guess they should be engaged in education full stop. So maybe this is true of all teaching situations. I also brought up Bloom's taxonomy, which you may be familiar with, because what you ask students to do also relates to how challenging it is. So quite often in education, there's too much going on at the bottom end of the pyramid, too much about remembering, then not so much about understanding and applying, etc., etc. And then evaluating and creating at the top. Sometimes there's not always time for this, but also sometimes you just don't get that far in a sense. What's interesting is that the different verbs here that are used, for example, and it can also be something that you take account of when you're planning your lesson, that, okay, it's not enough just to talk about what can you remember, what can you describe, or tell or find, but also giving opportunities to demonstrate understanding, for example. And then, of course, you've also got different types of knowledge, for example, factual knowledge or conceptual knowledge or procedural knowledge and metacognitive knowledge, etc. So I think that these statements that I had at the beginning, and also Bloom's taxonomy, also in the later versions, can be important things to bear in mind when you've got your ideal lesson plan. Which brings me on to the next slide of what an ideal lesson plan is. Now, it's not a lesson plan in the sense of slots to fill, but it's more a plan of action. In other words, what needs to be done before the class, or what needs to be done in the class so that successful learning takes place. And again, although it's sort of like coming up in connection with CLIL right now, I think that it is also equally important for teaching in German. So basically, in the rest of the session, I'm going to talk about the 8 different stages in the ideal lesson plan. I would ideally like some ideas from you in connection with activities which would be suitable for a particular stage. And I think here the easiest thing as well would be if you've got something to contribute, if you've got some ideas that you've already used, it's probably quicker if you just turn on your mics and tell us what ideas that you have, but it's also possible for you to add them in the chat, because I've now worked out so that it's open on my second screen. And then I'd also sort of like have to look at use of authentic materials at the end, depending on how we do in terms of time. Right, so here's a very brief outline of the first 4 stages, which I'll let you have a look at. And then the next 4 stages as well. So you can see it does have a sort of structure about, okay, this is how the class could begin, this is how the class could end, but which parts of the points are actually things which happen in class, or which sort of like happen before class when you're preparing it, could very much then sort of like depend on the particular subject and what have you. So the first thing that I'd like to do is to talk about the first stage, which is some sort of warm-up, I mean, discussion in the briefest sense of the word, or some sort of warm-up game or input, which connects the students with the topic that you're planning on teaching with the class. And I'd really be interested in hearing from you. How do you grab your students' attention at the beginning of a class? What sort of tricks or techniques or ideas have you got for grabbing attention, for sort of like providing a warm-up activity? Okay, so maybe it's easier to post it in the chat, because then I could just read it out. So Gertrude is suggesting that you can refer to current events or news. Okay, sort of like showing the direct relationship of what you're doing with the real world, if you like. Okay, woo, clap, and app to ask questions, right? Okay, so for example, you can then see what everybody wants to know, like the chat is showing us now. Then Johannes talked about curiosity. Yeah, exactly. How do you arouse their curiosity? Talking about videos, starting with a song, for example, which is on the particular topic. A controversial question, yeah, or a second idea from Elizabeth to interpret a non-straightforward picture. Yeah, sometimes it could be interesting with blurred pictures and bring them into focus. Have you heard? Yeah, exactly. Again, latest news, cartoons. So what you've done here, or brainstorming, for example, you've suggested using different types of modalities. So listening, looking, watching, thinking by sort of like provoking ideas. Great. Okay. So thanks for your ideas for stage one. And what I've got here is basically a collection of ideas which I add to every time I do this particular workshop. And so it gets longer and longer. So let's see, some of the things that you've already talked about would be, for example, the different types of pictures. This particular one was something old and something new. So again, sort of adding background information to the picture. Some of the teachers in the past also talked about vocabulary or connections. Here was mentioned cross-curricular connections, but it could also be connections to real life, as you mentioned in the chat. And then something which is sort of like quite typical in Austria, the sort of review at the beginning. I guess it's typical in other educational contexts as well. So finding out what people can remember from the previous class. Yeah, word clouds, for example, Dagmar's also added as well. That can also be really interesting in connection with vocabulary, for example, or apps like Kahoot and other apps that you're probably familiar with as well. So the idea is that you sort of like lead into the topic with a mixture of linguistic and non-linguistic input. So a mixture of language and then other modes of communication, so multimodal. The second stage in the ideal lesson plan is something which you might actually do with your students. So discussing the language content and learning skills. But I sort of like tend to have the idea that people are probably less likely to actually discuss it explicitly, but it's obviously something that you need to think about. And in particular, not just about your content aims, but also what are your language aims? So what vocabulary mostly do you want the students to know by the end of the session? But also what methods can you use to achieve those aims and what learning skills they're needed. So for example, later on, I'm going to do a jigsaw reading activity with you. And so, okay, this would be a method where it's obviously easier if everybody's already done the jigsaw method or the Expertenrunde, as it's often called in German. But also it means that you need sort of skills like how do you identify the most important points in a text? So how do you read for the main ideas, for example? That would be a particular reading skill which is needed, which presumably wouldn't have to be taught because they use that in all sorts of other contexts as well. And so in connection with language aims, it's mostly vocabulary related for those of you who already came to the previous sort of like subplenary, that at least from a receptive perspective, grammar doesn't tend to produce so many problems, but definitely vocabulary is something which needs thinking about. My earphones always keep on falling off my head. Right, so let's have a look at the third stage, which is about finding out what students already know. So going into a bit more detail now, they've already had their attention grabbed or their appetite whetted or background information sort of like brought to the foreground. How do you find out what students already know? How do you help them organize that information and how do they work out what else they want to learn? Because as somebody mentioned in the chat earlier on, curiosity means that you want to find out the answers to questions. So again, what I'd like to do is to have suggestions in the chat. I think that actually worked pretty well because then everybody can chat at once. Is how do you find out about students' background knowledge? In addition to the ideas that you already mentioned, like word clouds would be one possibility, or asking questions and things like that. So brainstorming on the blackboard, yeah, so group brainstorming, yeah, a short discussion. Answer garden, yeah, that's an app, I think, isn't it? Mind maps, yeah, okay, so Answer Garden is a website. Okay, so sort of like a pre-task, which gives you an idea as well of how much they know. Scaffolding, of course, providing support, trying to co-construct the knowledge that they have by asking questions. Okay, yeah, Quizlet, other types of quizzes. A matching task, yeah. Could be in the form of a worksheet, or it could be where you've got terms on the blackboard, or the great green board, or whatever color, where they have to move them around, for example, and match different concepts which go together. That's the funny thing about sitting in front of the screen. I know that teachers are usually quite impatient and very rarely give enough time for people to come up with answers. But seeing as nothing else is arriving right now, I've got an even longer list in connection with this. And so let's see what ideas that you already came up with. Okay, so we have mind maps already. Placemat, is that something that you're familiar with? And maybe I'll ask it as a rhetorical question, where you have a piece of paper. So for example, here you can see that there are 4 different corners. So you can ask people to write things in a group of 4 in the 4 different corners, then turn the piece of paper around and add other information. There's all sorts of variations in connection with placemat. Mentimeter, which I gave you the link to earlier on, you can try it out again afterwards as well. Also enables you to collect ideas and idea boards, as well as another app. You mentioned question and answers. I think that you talked about students' experiences. Okay, maybe that was earlier on, but I think what you'll see as well is that a lot of these activities, if you like, can be used at different points in the class. Then sort of like thinking back how much you know already, sort of like the thumbs up, thumbs down, or somewhere in between can also be a sort of like a quick visible way. Or I'm just looking at what I've got. Okay, I've only got the red cards left over, but it can also be interesting to have sort of red cards and green cards, so you can again see at one sort of like one moment how many people are showing you the red card, so to speak, and how many people are showing you green cards. If you've got enough space, and of course this is something which is not too easy at the moment, but maybe at some point things will return more to normal. It can also be interesting to sort of like place people in different positions in the room, because then you also sort of like get a physical idea of how much knowledge people have. We talked about brainstorming, we talked about word clouds, so not just Wordle, but word clouds in Mentimeter or in other apps as well. Then let's see what I've got here, which might need explaining. No, I think I'll just let you have a look at the remaining ideas because they've been mentioned as well to a certain extent, or they make sense without me having to explain them. Right, okay, so the next stage of the ideal lesson plan is about providing input, and this input can be in the form of reading a text, or it can be listening to something, it can be watching something, and the idea behind this input is that it takes the pressure off you as a teacher to provide input all of the time. So it sort of like gives you the opportunity to step back, if you like, and to provide input which somebody else has come up with. So we're going to have a look at how to deal with authentic input. I mean, okay, you've already got ideas yourself, but something that you might want to think about in connection with authentic input later on. And one of the important things about dealing with input is that you sort of like have a funnel effect. So imagine my hands are like a funnel, that you start off with the big picture, the general information, and you sort of like work your way down to the specific information afterwards. So the next stage, so basically what you've done, you've whetted their appetite, you've got them thinking about it, you've found out how much they know, you've given them some input, which involves you stepping back from the main role and letting a video or a text take over the role of providing input. And then the next stage is that you've got to do something with that input. And usually in class, it's a good idea if you've got them working together, because you can work on your own at home. So some sort of cooperative work in pairs or small groups, and using the information from the input to create something else. So again, it's over to you to make some suggestions about the different types of activities that you can do in connection with making students work together to deal with some inputs and to create something new. Right, okay. Okay, so basically what happens is that you've provided them with a text or something, and you've got some activities which you've organized with the text. And then what you need to do is to ask them to process the information to create something new. So for example, Eleanor has suggested an infographic. So where you'd be transforming written input or audio visual input into a visualization of the information which you saw. Yeah, so that's a good starting point. Thank you, Eleanor, for providing us with that. All right, and now everybody's going too fast, so I have to go back and have a look and see what you provided. A gapped text, for example, that would be you creating something else, but of course it would be one way of making sure whether they've understood. So another possibility would be ask them to create a gapped text, which they could give then to other members of the class. So let's see what the next information was. I'm going in the wrong direction. Yes, a statement. So a very brief summary, for example. Then some sort of symbol or some sort of icon that summarizes the information. Yes, so that would again be transforming text into some sort of visualization. Yeah, then taking the topic a stage further. Again, another idea from Elizabeth. So asking a question that requires them to think before they answer. So going back to Bloom's taxonomy, that would be sort of like on the creative or evaluative level, for example. Then Eleanor was, yeah, talking about the key points, for example. So doing something with the key points, transforming them into something else. Then Elizabeth, another Elizabeth has come up with the idea of creating a picture story, which is based around the content. So again, what you've got here is transformation activities, which of course demonstrate understanding of the text if they can transform it into something else. Yeah, Doris has come up with an idea of a crossword, and of course there are lots of great apps as well online where you can decide, okay, what are the most important vocabulary items? What do I need to know in order to be able to talk about this topic, and then create a crossword for a partner or for the rest of the group, or you can do it manually as well. It doesn't have to be online. Let's see what else has come up. Then asking questions, exactly, that's right, because if you can ask questions, as both Eleanor said and OG9EZJ, whoever you are, sorry, I'm sure that's not your name, but anyway, yes, exactly. If you can ask questions, then it also demonstrates understanding as well, yeah. Great. Okay. So again, you've come up with lots of different ideas in connection with cooperating together to compare what you've learned from the input and using the information to create something else, whether it's a linguistic output or whether it's another type of non-linguistic output. So I've got some other ideas, and I think this time there are some new ideas as well. So one of the ideas that teachers that I've worked with came up with was the idea of speed dating, which basically means that you've got, like, say, 2 or 3 minutes to tell as much information as possible to a partner, and then you move on to another partner and repeat the activity. This also works as a type of cogwheel, so where you've got an outer circle and an inner circle, and again you've got a time limit for passing on the information. Then the inner circle moves in this direction, the outer circle moves in the other direction, and then you have a different combination of pairs. And of course, this also depends on them actually being in the classroom. So Slatko came up with another example. Of course, if it's a technical subject and you're reading information on how to carry out the experiment, then you can actually do the experiment in class. So of course, turning it into practical work is a really important transformation as well. Then the jigsaw reading or partner puzzle Expertenrunde is something that we'll be trying out in a couple of minutes. You can also ask them to create a jumbled text, for example, so to make a summary and then chop up the text into smaller parts, which again, partners have to try and identify the correct order. Any type of information gap activity, so this is a typical thing for language teachers, but it can also be very useful to give different groups, that's right, to give different groups different pieces of information so that there's a real need to know. And Dagmar's also made that suggestion now in the chat, so using sort of like the marketplace or Marktstand, where everybody is responsible for presenting certain content areas. And it also means that the audience is sort of like interested in finding out more because it's something new, something that they're not familiar with. Then a couple of teachers talked about sort of like class newspapers, so providing posters which are not presented in a poster session, but are then put on the wall, and then you can go around and have a look at the different answers which they've provided. Right, okay, sorry, there should have been a full stop at the end of that particular sentence. Yeah, so looking at the answers on the wall in a type of class newspaper, full stop. So let's move on to stage 6. And again, you can see here that I've added the comment. This could be something which you don't necessarily do explicitly, but in order to enable students to improve, you also need to give them feedback on what they've done so far. And this feedback can be in connection with the language that they've used. It can be in connection with the content, but it can also be in connection with the procedures or the methods that you've used as well. And sometimes this feedback you could keep to yourself and think about, okay, next time I do this activity, I need to think about organizing it in a slightly different way. Or for example, in terms of the language focus, it could be making a note of language issues that quite a few people had and using that as inputs in a further lesson, for example. And obviously, if there were content issues, that would also be something that you'd want to clear up and make sure that there are no misunderstandings. So then stage 7 sort of like also fits in with stage 6. You can see here that it's sometimes difficult to say where one stage ends and where the next stage begins. But there is some sort of presentation as well at class level and not just at individual, so pair work or group work level. And here it depends how many different topics are being talked about. So as Dagmar said in the chat, the use of the marketplace or Marktstand would be really useful if there's different elements of the same topic which are being used. Whereas if everybody's essentially worked on the same theme, then it can actually be quite boring to listen to exactly the same presentation sort of like 5 or 6 times. So one way of getting around this would be to ask one group to actually present the outcome of the work that they did on the input, and then asking the other groups to contribute new things. Now, of course, one of the advantages for this is that the other groups have to pay attention so that they know that they're not repeating what the first group has already said, and that they also then need to remember what the first group said so that they can add new points. And of course, as a teacher, it would also be important to keep an eye on who's working in the groups and which groups need to sort of like then present something the next time that you do a similar activity. Then the last stage is sort of like the reviewing stage, and this is also something which quite often is then at the beginning of the next lesson that you have. So reviewing the outcomes, finding out how people did here. And I think that most of the ideas that I've got on this particular slide, well, no, actually there aren't very many ideas on this slide. I only wrote down a couple of things here. I've mentioned some of them already, so like the thumbs up, thumbs down. There's all sorts of different types of self-assessment or peer assessment, which you mentioned in connection with previous stages, like worksheets, all sorts of quizzes, checklists and what have you. And then a couple of nice ideas that I came across, or rather that teachers suggested, was coming up with an official cheat sheet in the sense of deciding what is the essence of the topic that we've just talked about. So the 5 most important words, for example, which I find difficult to remember, or the 5 most important dates, or the 5 most important elements, for example, or the 5 most important stages, or the 5 things that we like to forget, for example. So there shouldn't be too many things on the cheat sheet, but it should really focus on the essence. And the second activity, which is mentioned here, is actually producing a cheat sheet that you would theoretically maybe want to use in an exam situation. But you've only got 4 by 4 centimeters. So I'm just having a look for my ruler to see how big this piece of paper is. Okay, so yeah, this is 4 by 4 centimeters. So if I put it on the palm of my hand, it takes up a lot less space. And of course, the idea again with this is that you need to think about what the essence is. And by processing the information, it also makes you think about what's important. So again, sort of like producing an official cheat sheet, and then the fact that you've had to work with that cheat sheet also sort of like helps you come up with the different activities, sorry, the different pieces of information. So what I'm going to do now is going to be interesting, I think, because I'm not quite sure how it's going to work. Yeah, because I really don't know how many people are actually actively taking part in the workshop at the moment. So I sort of like need you to say yes if you're listening, and then I'll just sort of like take a quick look at people who are saying yes. So if you're here and listening, can you just type yes into the chat, please? A certain number of people. What I'm going to do then is to write down people's names in a couple of minutes when I've got some time. Yeah, there's an activity coming up which you're going to do. So again, if nobody's put their hands up yet, if you still want to add your name to the list, then you can do. Because what I want to work through now is looking at how you can deal with reading and listening strategies. And you can see here, this is where I've got my sort of like English teacher hat on, if you like. So these are activities which English teachers are definitely familiar with, and which I hope that you're also familiar with in thinking about how to deal with input, which is authentic. and then how to turn that into relevant output. So what we're going to do is we're going to move away from lints, which is where we all are at the moment, and we're going to beam ourselves here. So where are we? Okay, let's see, there's some people who are posting. Yes, that's right, we're in Hallstatt. Okay, right, and you're going to find out why we're in Hallstatt in a couple of minutes, but I'm not going to tell you for the time being. So Hallstatt, for those of you who are not from Austria, is sort of a very popular tourist destination. And I hear that this summer it was crowded with Austrian tourists as opposed to sort of like tourists from abroad. Right, okay, so the next thing, what I'm going to do is to ask you to identify what a list of words have in common, and this list of words, but I do not want you to Google them. I do not want you to cheat. I want you to think to yourself, do I know what topic connects all of these words? And don't write down any ideas yet in the chat until I ask you to. So basically what I'm going to do now is I'm going to write down the names of the people who are here, who told me earlier on that they are here. Then I'm going to come back and ask you to post what you think this topic is in the chat. And in the meantime, I'm also going to sort of like put you in groups. And this is all going to be very interesting about whether this works. But if it doesn't, hey ho, I tried. So you can think about what these words have in common with each other. And I'm going to write down some names. Right, in the meantime, if you've thought of the topic, actually what I'd like you to do now is to post the topic in the chat, okay? So Ellen's already posted an idea, everybody else post their things. I'll just add some more names. Okay, so let me have a look. Okay, so we had the suggestion of fishing. Then ways of connecting things. Okay, so all sorts of, yeah, that's interesting, with a bridge connecting two sides of a river, then a peg connecting two pieces of wood, then the frog connecting jackets. Okay, didn't work for tailgut or purfling. Anatomy of frogs, crafting, carbon dating, shape, construction. Okay, pirates. Oh, I like that. Right. Okay, so all sorts of different ideas then. I'm going to show you now what it was about, and obviously nobody did Google it. Thank you very much. This is how they're related, which is not something that anybody thought of. And it also explains why I chose the picture of Hallstatt, because the HTL for Instrumentenbau is in Hallstatt. And so that's where they make, for example, violins or something like that. Right, okay, so which one was close? The pirates. Okay, frog spawn building, something to do with water. Yeah, I see that I missed crafting. Yes, exactly. So it is a craft, of course, putting together music instruments. Yeah, well done. So, okay, now I don't know if any of you play an instrument, but I play the viola. So this is actually a picture of a violin. So a violin would be, let's say, about this long, for example. And I play the viola, which is a Bratsche in German, or it's also called viola as well. And it's bigger, but you still sort of like play it like this. So it's a pretty big instrument. It's not as big as a cello. It's quite heavy. And what it basically means is that viola players are much more likely to retire early because it's hard work playing a viola. So how many of you out there play an instrument? If you play an instrument, can you again type the name of the instrument into the chat? Okay, so the flute, yeah, trumpet, piano. Have we got any more instrument players? Violin, I've got no idea what that is in English. Okay, a trombone, a guitar, accordion, guitar and piano. Okay, Dagmar, then you can decide which one. Then church organs as well, right? Okay, great. What I'd like you to think about now is that if you were a violin, it could be a French horn. Like you have in an orchestra, basically. A French horn would be an orchestra horn, as opposed to a hunting horn, for example. Great, okay, thanks ever so much. So one of those instruments, what I'd like you to think of is, why would a musician who plays one of those instruments need to retire early? So why would a flute player have to retire early because of playing the flute? Or why would a horn player have to retire early because of playing the horn? So again, if you've got some ideas, if you can add them in the chat, again, maybe remind us of what the instrument is. So like say flute, and then a colon or a dash and saying, okay, this is why musicians would have to retire early. I'll just give everybody time to put something in before I go through the ideas, because it's off-putting if I'm talking to you. Gustav, you could think of a specific instrument then. Okay, so let's see. We've got things like, yeah, physical problems like with the spine or the back in particular, for all sorts of different instruments because of the way that you sit. Then what other ideas were mentioned? Yeah, arthritis as well. So from being in a similar position. If you play a wind instrument, then yes, your lungs definitely get older, so your lung capacity. I think if you play as a professional musician, then there could be all sorts of psychological reasons like competition to get into good orchestras, but also to keep your job in a good orchestra as well. Okay, then psychological issues with trumpet playing as well, yeah. Okay, can you get those high notes? Just before lockdown, on the 1st of November, we had one last concert in the Musikverein with the University Orchestra playing Mahler's Second. And those of you who know Mahler's Second, in the last movement, there's the Fan-Trompeten, and they have to play some really high notes, which are really exposed. And so I think that was really stressful for them as well. And of course, if you're sitting in front of the brass instruments, then deafness is also an issue as well. So basically what I did, I Googled an article on problems which musicians have and the reasons why they gave for retiring early on medical grounds. Now let's see. I think actually you've mentioned all of the ones which were here. So different physical issues with yeah, different parts of the body and the respiratory system. Memory loss you didn't mention, but of course that's a general issue and not a special issue for musicians. Noise level was something that was mentioned, again, pulmonary function, and then the emotional and artistic strains as well. So basically what happens is, I said I play the viola and it's sort of like hard work. So what happened was somebody invented a new type of viola, and it's called the Pellegrina. And although these pictures here maybe look like they've been sort of like pulled out of perspective, this is literally what the viola looks like from the front. So full on frontal, if you like, from the side and from the back. So it's not a question of perspective, it's that the shape of the instrument has actually been changed. So what we're going to try and do now, and I take the risk that this is not going to work, but we'll still see whether it does, is that I've set up some Google Docs, at least I hope I've set them up in the right way, where in 4 different groups, you have a different Google Doc with information about the Pellegrina. And this is the Jigsaw cooperative strategy that I talked about earlier on, which is also known as the Expertenrunde or something else, which I've forgotten in German. It's got quite a lot of different names. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to post a link to a quarter of the text about the Pellegrina in the chat, and I've written 3 people's names. So I'm assuming that those 12 people who told me that they were here haven't disappeared in the meantime. And if you're one of the people who didn't tell me that you were here, so I haven't got your name, then you can just choose one of the texts randomly. So this is where the fun starts, as I said. Text 1 is for Thomas, Christopher, and Johanna. Oh, I've got to work out how to reply to everybody. Hang on a minute. Right. Okay. So you should be able to copy. You should be able to click on the link. Then text 2 is for Eva, Elizabeth, MB, and OG9EZJ. Text 3 is for Gustav, Christiana, and Elizabeth WP. And text 4, if I didn't say the wrong one before, is for Patricia, Christian, and Jill. And as I said, anybody else, you can choose which one of these links that you want to do. Now, I'm not just sending you off to have a look at the text. I'm going to give you just 3 minutes to have a look at it. And I want you to think about it in terms of the following table. So my question is, what are the differences between a regular string instrument, so between a violin and a viola, and the Pellegrina? So it's just coming up to 5 o'clock on my computer at least. So I'm going to give you until 3 minutes past 5 to make a note of the differences between a violin and a viola and the Pellegrina in relation to just one of the texts that I posted the link for. Is that okay for everybody? Right, okay, so it's 3 minutes past 5 on my computer at least. So regardless of how far you got, basically what I'm going to do now is sort of like say what I would have done if it was, for example, if I had breakout rooms or something like that. But if you come back and have a look at the slide on the screen, you can see that to start with, you would then have people who were working on the same text. So, for example, I would ask Thomas, Christopher, and Johanna to get together and to share the information that they had in their individual tables comparing a regular string instrument with the Pellegrina. And I'd ask Eva and Elizabeth and the third person in that group to do the same thing, etc., etc. So these would be the squares that you've got in the middle, the puzzle, the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, which are the same color. And then, of course, what I would do is I'd combine people from different groups. And so I'd ask one expert from each of the groups. I mean, I'm sure that you're all familiar with this idea of the Jigsaw cooperative learning strategy or Expertenrunde. I'd ask different experts to come together from the groups and to share the information with each other. So this is a sort of like a typical information gap activity, which we do a lot in English classes. It gives the groups the opportunity to check that they've all understood things correctly in advance before going out and talking about it to the other groups. And of course, each of the members needs to be equally familiar. You can't have somebody sitting back and thinking, oh, I don't have to do any work, because they also have to represent their group. This is quite often then done also with some sort of visualization. In this particular case, we've got the table here. And the reason why I gave you just a relatively short period of time was because I literally wanted you to read the text as fast as possible, probably to look for words like violin and viola, or string, or to look for pellegrina. As it was a comparison, you might have also looked for comparative adjectives and adverbs as well, so that you'd then be able to scan for the details without actually looking at the specifics yet. So this is, remember I was talking about the funnel. This would be the general information to start with, looking at the general differences between regular string instruments and the pellegrina. What I then do in the second round is, for example, I think that all of the texts that I gave you had an illustration. There was some sort of figure in there. So maybe the second round would be a more specific task connected to these figures, to the illustrations, maybe explaining the differences to a non-expert. So this is an idea of mediation, of passing the information on from a group of experts to people who don't know anything about instruments, which means that you cannot use technical vocabulary because a non-expert will not know what you mean. So you have to think of ways of summarizing it, or synonyms or paraphrases or something like that. And then I would do another activity. So again, more specific in terms of language, and then maybe come up with a list of important words in connection with the pellegrina in this particular text. Now, as my follow-up activity, I might give them something like this. So you can see here, this is a cartoon from a book by Gerard Hoffnung, called the Hoffnung Symphony Orchestra, and this would be a variation on a cello, for example, for a cellist who's been playing professionally for too many years and is nearing retirement, for example. So what I would ask them to do would be to decide on an instrument. It could be the instrument that they play themselves, or another instrument, for example. Decide on a problem to solve. So here, for example, maybe the cellist doesn't like getting up early, and solving the problem by having the cuckoo clock, which isn't a cuckoo clock, but anyway, with the pendulum playing the cello for him while he has time to eat his breakfast and have his toast and his coffee as well, and things like that. So this would be a sort of like a follow-up activity potentially. And so what I've done here is I've gone to stage 4 of this ideal lesson plan, which is how to deal with inputs. And I'm sure English teachers among you are familiar with this particular diagram here. The sort of like the reading or listening cycle. You can also see that it's quite old-fashioned because it goes back to the days where you have tapes and videos as opposed to YouTube videos and podcasts. But I think what the most important thing about this cycle is, which we've just worked on. So we did the lead in, where I was asking you with the vocabulary. Then I asked you to think about problems in connection with the instruments you play. So that was the pre-task work. Then the next task was to read about the differences in connection with the pellegrina and standard musical instruments, or standard violins and violas, in the Google doc, and then normally you would have told me what information that you found out. I would assume that you could manage to do the task, and then I'd come up with the second task, which was the one about the content being more specific, describing the figures, for example, and then a third task maybe focusing on vocabulary. But what I'd like to draw your attention to now is the box in the top right-hand corner. Is that the difficulty has to be in relation to the task that you ask somebody to do with a particular piece of input. You don't necessarily have to find material which is, like, say, easy enough for your students, but you do have to think of tasks which make the material easy enough for the students to be able to understand it. So, and that's another reason for this funnel approach, because if you've got an overview of the text, it makes it easier afterwards to look for the details. You could debate then whether it's better to have the task first and then provide the text or the tape. But in fact, if you tell people what the task is first, then they know what to focus on. So it's sort of like less stressful if you know that you've only got to look for the main ideas, rather than if you read the text and think, well, what am I meant to remember? What am I meant to know as a result of reading the text? And this is also a process, so it's a cycle going through sort of like several rounds, if you like. And in the process of doing the task, we're more interested in the process of it happening, and then the product is sort of like what happens at the end, sort of putting everything together, if you like. So in connection with these authentic texts, as I said, it's not the text itself which is too difficult, but what you ask them to do with the text, which can be too challenging. And so in connection with reading and listening inputs, obviously you as a teacher need to decide in advance what is the content, what should they know at the end, but also you need to think about, well, what is the minimum amount of language that I want them to know after they've dealt with the text? Because there's always going to be lots and lots of words that they don't know, but what is the essential vocabulary? What do you want them to remember so that they can actually talk about the content in English? Then how are you going to tune into the topic, which of course is particularly appropriate for this activity with the musical theme. The general task, that was where I asked you to go and have a look at the Google Docs, and a first round of silent reading and then discussing the answers, which unfortunately I didn't give you the opportunity to do. Now, why do I have silent in bold? Well, the main reason is that probably most of your students are not planning on becoming news readers, and I expect most of them are not planning on becoming priests either. And a lot of professions do not involve the skill of being able to read out a text so that other people can understand what the text is about. I'm sure if you think back to your school days and maybe some of your English teachers, and if they asked you to read out a text aloud, that if you weren't the first person, you spent some of that time working out, okay, which text is it I'm going to have to read? Is it the next paragraph? Is it the next line already? And you're then away from the person who's talking about the text. And if they're a bad reader, it means it's also difficult to understand. So silent reading, that's the way that we normally read, and it's certainly advantageous if you get people used to reading. And if they've got a task to do, you can also see that they're reading because they're working on the task. You don't sort of like have to wait and see until you've finished reading the text out. So it's not good reading practice, and it's not actually that useful in terms of pronunciation practice either. And in the first round, it's also really important that you don't sort of like focus on every single word, because if you do, then you have this idea that you need to understand every single word in a text to be able to understand the gist of it. And that's not true. It's something that you do automatically in German or in your first language. And it should also be something that you think about doing in other languages as well, that you try and get the gist of a text the first time round and then go back to it to find out some extra information. So I didn't do the second reading, but this was the one where I suggested looking at the illustrations in the text and being able to describe the illustrations for a non-expert audience, so not using technical vocabulary, paraphrasing, summarizing, etc. And again, you'd want to discuss the answers once they've had the time to to do this task. This also fits into what we were saying earlier on about the other stages of the ideal lesson plan. And also fits in with what you were talking about at the beginning of the workshop, that if you can create curiosity and ask them to sort of like find out more about a particular topic, that's also a lot more motivating. Now, the second sentence that I've got here, encourage them to guess the meaning of unknown words. Actually, as I said in the subplenary earlier on, you need to know about 95 to 98% of a text in order to have a good chance of guessing the meaning of unknown words. So that's like 19 out of 20 words. That's a lot of vocabulary that you need to know. So guessing the meaning of unknown words is going to be easier if you've got cognates, that is, if there's a relationship between English and a similar word in their mother tongue. Or if it's a morphologically complex word where you can take it apart and say, okay, this is a negative prefix, for example, this is a suffix which turns a noun into a verb, then it might be possible to guess the meaning of unknown words, but otherwise it's actually a pretty complicated activity. And then finally, you would use the contents and or the language as the stimulus for further activities. And this is where we'd go back to stage 5, which we talked about earlier on, which is the product, the cooperative work to compare results, and then stage 6, which is, hang on a minute, no, stage 7, presenting the outcomes, for example. And so basically, after you've been through this cycle, you have hopefully demonstrated understanding, or that is, the students have demonstrated understanding, and they've also been able to recycle the contents and language, which of course brings me back to one of the earlier statements that I said, that you have to learn through language and you have to use language to learn. It also brings me back to the statement of that input then has to be turned into output if you want learning to take place. And you also want your students to work smart in the lesson because you've worked smart in advance. So the last thing that I'd like to share with you, and maybe this could be an opportunity, Andreas, can people turn on their microphones if they want?
Yes, sure, they can, yeah.
Right, okay. So I'd really like to sort of hear some people as well. I love this diagram here of Noah's Ark, which I got from Beate Kralicek, who's also at the symposium, so from the Hochschule für Agrar- und Umweltwissenschaften in the 13th district in Vienna. What I'd like you to do is to have a look at all of these really interesting statements about we're all in the same boat as CLIL teachers, and I'd like you to choose one and tell us why you like this particular statement. Okay, so who's chosen one and can explain why it's particularly appropriate for them in terms of CLIL?
Well, I can if you want to.
Okay, yes, please. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you need to see me too, or I'm just talking? So,
okay, up to you. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm Tanya. All right.
Hi, Tanya.
I chose number 5 because what I see in CLIL is another kind of providing them with offering something. Mm-hmm. Whether CLIL is a possibility for them to learn or to study, I mean, it's up to them basically. It's another offer. So many different kinds of approaches and so many different kinds of methods. Still, there will be people who say, I can't deal with all this CLIL input or. But still, so this is what I see. Don't leave anyone out. Give them all the friendly calls. So you call them, you tell them this could be something for you. This could be an offer. This could be an opportunity. But still, they have to. It's up to them.
Yes, right, exactly.
So you can. This is what I always say: is you can be the best, kind of entertainer and play Kasperl for them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the clown.
Play the clown for them and I don't know, be an actor or whatever.
Yeah.
And still,
and it doesn't always work. Yeah.
It doesn't always work. And CLIL
Yeah.
doesn't always work either, maybe for some people. So
sure. Great. Okay, thanks, Tanya, ever so much.
welcome.
Johanna, which one did you choose?
Let's see, I chose number 8. Remember,
Okay.
the Ark was built by amateurs, the Titanic by professionals. And the reason I chose it is because I am teaching this CLIL class at the PH Wien for the first time. I'm not really a CLIL teacher officially. I tried to support my colleagues at the HTL when I taught there. And I feel like an amateur teaching this. And yet I feel that the students I've been getting really good results. They're very happy to be there. We've been doing it all online. And so the feedback I've been getting, at least, is that I'm doing something right. And I hope that that will help my students do something right too.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so there would be all in one boat is also a really appropriate sort of like
absolutely
title for that.
We're all
well,
in this
isn't it?
together.
Exactly. Yep. And at least it's safer to be in the Ark than it is in the Titanic in that particular case. Yeah. Okay. Right. Thanks ever so much, Johanna, for your contribution. Somebody else. And thanks for turning the video on as well.
So number 6, speed isn't always an advantage. The snails made it on board with the cheetahs. So this is a nice one, a very nice one, and a very appropriate one when thinking of a CLIL class, because it's not speed that matters. You have to give your pupils time until they can understand content and language. The combination is the difficult thing, I would say. And you have to take more time. But in the end, I think it's even more efficient and the outcome is even better than if you had taught the same content in their mother tongue.
Right.
You rush through things when you just use their mother tongue because you think, okay, they will all understand you. But as soon as you use a different language, I think they have to focus much more, even on the content, not just on the language. So if you take your time, if you're patient, if you give your pupils the time, then I think they will certainly make it. They will make it on board.
Yeah, I think so as well. Did everybody else manage to hear that? Because it got louder towards the end. So I hope that otherwise a sort of like quick summary that yes, everybody makes it there in the end. And that because you have to sort of like focus on the content in a different way by also concentrating on the language, it also means that it's somehow processed in a different way. And maybe in a more efficient way in the long term was suggested than it would be if you were using your mother tongue. And I can also sort of like second this from experience, because when I was teaching in Klagenfurt, the physics teacher always used to say, I don't tell them stories. I'm not good at sort of like telling them stories in English, so I tend not to tell them at all. So she focused a lot more on sort of like the content and the language. And at the end of the school year, she reckoned that the, hang on a minute, I'm just trying to see where I am. I'm probably somewhere at the top. I guess I've not disappeared. Yeah, right, okay. So by the end of the year, sort of like she'd taught them this much in CLIL, and they remembered that much. But if she compared that with a regular sort of physics lesson in Germans, she taught them that much at the beginning, you know, by the end of the year. And at the end of the year, they also only know that much. So that CLIL sort of like by default has to sort of like be a much more intensive way, and also encourages the students to think about things more intensively, which means that they're less likely to maybe forget it. Yeah. Okay, thank you. We've got a bit more time. Anybody else chose another of these ones? Okay, right, so Ava's saying that number 4 is most suitable because for teachers, it's also safer and nicer to work in a team. And I think that that's true. It was mentioned earlier on that number 4 was in connection with the students working together, but I also think it's really important for CLIL teachers, or actually for teachers in general, to work in a team as well. Right, okay, so if nobody else wants to talk about any of those points, then I've also got my fat questions and my skinny questions from earlier on. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to make in the last 5 minutes or so?
Well, may I comment on what you were saying before?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd like to comment on two of the those statements you were presenting before. There was the one thing about travel in pairs. And I thought to myself, well, it actually doesn't make much of a difference whether we are talking about subject teacher and subject teachers working together, or subject teacher and English teacher working together. In my teacher training seminars, I very much promote CLIL policies for every single college. And for me, this is one of the very, very important components of CLIL policy, cooperation between colleagues. And
within schools, between schools as well, it would be so important. Yeah, I mean, okay, if you work in the Instrumentenbau in Hallstatt, or if you work in the Waffen department in Villach, you're going to have problems. But with so many of the other subjects, there's more than one of you out there. So yes, the more cooperation that there is Austrian-wide or internationally, I think is really important point to get across. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the second thing I'd like to add something to is about the speed isn't always an advantage, and kind of the amount of how much students are gonna learn in CLIL that you showed. You might have heard that a colleague of mine from the University of Education and me, we are doing, and together with Beate from the University of Agriculture, Pedagogy, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We are doing a research project with the colleges for agriculture and forestry, trying to find out about knowledge acquisition. So do students learn as much in CLIL as in their German-speaking lessons? And yeah, there will be a presentation of first results tomorrow. So my colleague from the University of Education will speak about that at 9 o'clock in the morning. It's the Project Village talk. And first results, I can say, are very, very promising. So it's definitely not what many teachers are afraid of, that you need to reduce so much of your content and students would learn less than in their German-speaking lessons. No, they don't. So probably they learn different stuff. Probably the speed is a different one, but the results in the very end are very, very promising. And we don't need to be afraid of any kind of, some people call that learning deficits being produced by CLIL lessons. No, not at all.
And I think that's because for CLIL to be successful, as I said also, that in the class, the students have to work smart. You as a teacher have done the work before, you've prepared it, you've given them the opportunities, but they can't just sit there and listen to you lecturing if that happens, because that doesn't work in a foreign language. Actually, it probably doesn't work that well in German either, but that's another issue. So yes, I would really believe that those are the findings, that because they've had to process the information and there's a different type of teaching, that I'm not surprised, and I'm glad that you've got proof as well for that. Great. Unfortunately, I've got to teach tomorrow morning, so
I know.
But I'll keep an eye out for the results then.
Yeah, we're going to present our stuff later on as well, because we are, well, of course, all the COVID-19 crisis sort of messed up our schedule and we couldn't do as much as we wanted to do. But last year we were doing stuff in subjects like project management and organic farming. And this year we are doing stuff in 2 subjects, in history and civics education, as well as in accounting.
Okay, good, great.
We're running more or less the same lessons in German and in the CLIL mode in those colleges all around Austria. And
of course, what's interesting about sort of like history and accounting is that it's not just in connection with the agricultural colleges, but you can also go to Hack and HTL and say, look here, this is true for this school type, but it is also applicable for you. So really great combination of subjects. Okay, so anything else? Anybody else? No, then I will say thank you at least for those people who contributed to the different activities. And again, I'll make these slides available. I'll send them so that they can be put on the SEB's webpage so that you've got them there. And yeah, everybody then enjoy the rest of the conference. Andreas, thank you for all of your organization. It was, yeah, hey, people can put their thumbs up. How can I do that? Oh.
So, well, I can tell you, I'm really happy that it worked as it worked, because it was all kind of on a trial and error basis. But,
yeah. Okay. Well, I've got no idea how I can put my thumbs up or wave my hand, but anyway, so I'll sort of like do it like this. You can see me.
You have on taskbar, find the reactions.
Yeah, I've just got too many.
Press it so you can choose whatever you want.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody.
No. Thanks, Latko, but I'm impossible.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay,
thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Isabella, as well. And yeah, bye to everybody. Have a good evening. See you.